Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time William Mahone delivered a devastating attack against the Union Fifth Corps at the Battle of Globe Tavern, but had to ultimately fall back. Now, the Confederacy launches another major assault against the Union threat to the Weldon Railroad. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Robert E. Lee dealt with multiple threats at the time of the Battle of Globe Tavern. Winfield Scott Hancock in the 2nd Corps was across the James River, but was slowly moving back across to the south side. The Weldon Railroad, south of Petersburg, was being captured by Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps. Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard stripped the Petersburg front of all available troops to send to A.P. Hill in order to attack the 5th Corps south of the city. If he sent more, it could mean disaster if the 18th Corps attacked the lightly held area near the Appomattox River. On August 20th, despite the dangers to Petersburg, Lee and Beauregard deemed it necessary to throw back Warren. Beauregard summoned Bushrod Johnson, one of his division commanders, to supply a brigade of men to A.P. Hill for the attack. Instead of sending an already formed brigade, he sent 4 regiments, one taken from each of his brigades that was held in reserve. These units hadn't fought together, and after seeing what Johnson sent him, Beauregard sent them back to their reserve position. According to one historian, the whole day was wasted by the Confederacy. On the 19th, Mahone captured a large segment of Warren's force and dealt them considerable damage, but given the Federals' time, only allowed them the ability to dig in and fortify their position on the Weldon Railroad. A member of the 147th New York recalled, "Through the night, cold and rainy, the men labored faithfully, and the morning dawned upon a formidable line of breastworks, stoutly made and tastefully finished. These works were erected under peculiar disadvantages. The night was very dark, with frequent showers, which kept the clothing of the men saturated with water during the entire night, this rendering labor very difficult, and added to this, the men were almost broken down from the effect of excessive fatigue of the 3 days previous. For the erection of these works, under the circumstances, I think the 147th is entitled to as much credit as if it had fought and won a great battle." Mahone was incredibly familiar with the landscape in and around Petersburg, which led to his successful attack on August 19th. However, one man knew the ground much better than him, a Petersburg native named Roger Pryor. Pryor graduated from the University of Virginia, ran a successful newspaper in Virginia, and toward the end of the 1850s and until 1861 represented Virginia in the U.S. House of Representatives. A fire-eaten secessionist, Pryor battled in Congress with abolitionists, and when he challenged one to a duel, the opponent picked bowie knives for them to use, and Pryor backed out. He traveled to Charleston, South Carolina in the early months of 1861 to urge the firing on Fort Sumter, and when the Civil War broke out, he joined the 3rd Virginia Infantry, rising up to brigadier general, but proved inept at large command. He resigned in 1863, only to join the Confederate cavalry as a private and scout. It was Pryor who Mahone chose to reconnoiter the area. Pryor climbed a tree to view the Union position. He could see Ayres's division, with their left flank in the air, unguarded, but he couldn't see beyond them to notice Charles Griffin's division east of the railroad and Globe Tavern. He didn't investigate further, and declared to Mahone that Ayres's men constituted the left flank of the Union Army. On August 21st, Hill and his 2 division commanders, Henry Heath and Mahone, were ready for the attack. Mahone was given additional troops for the planned assault, arousing them at 2 a.m. for their march to hit what Mahone thought was the flank of the Union Army. A little before 9 a.m., a Confederate artillery barrage opened on the dug-in Union troops, silencing one Federal artillery battery and causing destruction in the ranks of the Blue Infantry. Colonel Duchesne, commanding the Maryland Brigade and Romaine Ayres's division, was decapitated by a cannonball, and command went to Colonel Samuel Graham. When Mahone's force approached what they thought was the Union flank, they quickly realized that they were horribly mistaken and misled by Pryor. Hill conferred with Mahone and agreed that they would continue the attack, but that Johnson Hagood's brigade would need to move to the right to protect the main body's flank. Mahone went to Hagood's command to put it in the proper place, with Hill remaining with the main force, and sent it into battle. The Union defenders were prepared for the attack behind their breastworks. However, the rain drenched the ammunition of the blue soldiers. It was a continuous snapping of caps until the exploding caps had dried the powder sufficiently to burn and generate gas enough to blow the ball out of the gun. The enemy continued to advance, and it began to look like a bayonet fight for a finish. Finally, the charges began to explode and eject the ball. The delayed volleys made it more deadly for the Confederates because they were able to get within 50 yards of the Federals before mass projectiles ripped into their ranks. Brigadier General John C. Sanders was hit in both thighs by Federal bullets, severing the femoral artery. Without falling, his men rushed to him, and he said, "Take me back." Some of his comrades carried him a short distance to the rear, where they laid him down, and he died. Some of Hill's men made it further than others, but all were pushed back. But the threat to the Union line wasn't over. Henry Heath's division followed Hill's attack with one of their own, driving in the pickets toward the main Union line. Suddenly, a number of men fell flat on their faces, and we thought that they had been hit by the enemy's fire. To our surprise, they hurriedly scrambled to their feet again and continued toward us. A few steps more, and again they plunged to the ground. It dawned upon us then what was the cause of their strange behavior. They had tripped over the telegraph wires, stretched about a foot high along the ground. The men, too, realized what was the matter, and they carefully picked their way the rest of the distance, being greeted with laughter as they approached. They, however, were in no mood to enjoy the merriment. William McRae's brigade began to hug the ground as musketry and canister fire flew over their heads. They waited for word that Mahone's attack was a success before launching themselves against the main Union fortifications. Soon, behind them, two other brigades of North Carolinians, under John L. Harris and John R. Cook, advanced across the fields and timber north of the Globe Tavern. The Union troops stopped them, just like they did McRae. Anticipating an attack on his left flank, Cook stopped a little shorter than Harris. To the south, Hagood was preparing his men for their own attack, unaware that the previous assaults failed. His South Carolinians advanced toward the enemy fortifications and came under a withering fire. Hagood quickly recognized that it was hopeless to continue the attack, but the roar of battle prevented his men from hearing his command to halt and fall back. Quickly, blue troops came out of their entrenchments and began to encircle the Southerners in a thin line. Captain Dennis B. Daly, the provost marshal of Lysander Cutler's division, rode out to demand the rebels surrender. Some of Hagood's men began to surrender. Many stopped fighting altogether, and some continued the fight, but most of the firing stopped as both sides watched what was going to happen next. Hagood knew that if his men surrendered, the entire brigade would be lost, so he rode up to Daly and told him his men wouldn't surrender and to hand the flag of the 11th South Carolina back to him. Daly refused, and an argument ensued. Finally, Hagood asked a final time whether Daly would give the flag back to him. Daly defiantly said no. Hagood drew his pistol and shot Daly. As the provost reeled in his saddle and fell, Hagood grabbed the reins of his horse, and a staff member grabbed the flag. Hagood then led his men out of the encirclement, but at a terrible cost. Of the 740 officers and men who went into battle, only 449 came back. A devastating loss to Hagood's command. Mahone encountered Robert E. Lee on the battlefield, who came to look over the engagement. He told the army commander that if he was given 2 more brigades, he could throw the Union from the railroad. Lee called up for troops from Charles Field's division north of the Appomattox River to Petersburg. As Confederate troops moved toward Globe Tavern, Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade ordered 9th Corps troops and 2nd Corps troops to reinforce Warren. By the afternoon, Lee's requested reinforcements were in Petersburg. Lee realized it was too late to launch another attack against Warren. At nightfall, Lee ordered any attempt to dislodge the Union from the Weldon Railroad abandoned and pulled his troops back to Petersburg. The Battle of Globe Tavern ended with the Union suffering 4,279 casualties, with 2,879 of those being prisoners. The Confederacy lost around 2,400 soldiers, with about 800 being prisoners. Lee wrote a report to President Jefferson Davis explaining the military situation after the failed attempt to dislodge Warren from the railroad. Dislodging the enemy could not be accomplished even with additional troops, without a greater sacrifice of life than we can afford to make, or than the advantages of success would compensate for. The proximity of the enemy and his superiority of numbers rendered it possible for him to break the road at any time, and even if we could drive him from the position he now holds, we could not prevent him from returning to it or to some other point, as our strength is inadequate to guard the whole road. The South Side Railroad and the Richmond and Danville Railroad were still not usable, so this meant that Richmond and Petersburg were about to endure lean times as food reserves became depleted. It would be about 6 weeks before the fall harvest could replenish their food supply. To compensate for the loss of supplies coming in from the railroad, Lee organized a wagon train to bring supplies in along the Boydton Plank Road into Petersburg. Lee added to his note to the President, "Without some increase of strength, I cannot see how we are to escape the natural military consequences of the enemy's numerical superiority."